Hi biology, this is Miss Satterley. I'm going to go over the macromolecules notes that we have. Okay. All right, so another word for macromolecule is organic compound. Organic compounds are compounds composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Now, depending on the type of organic compound, sometimes we see nitrogen and also phosphorus. But overall, organic compounds are going to have those three elements. There are four major types of organic compounds. It includes carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So we're going to look at each of those in more detail. But before we get to that, I have to explain a couple things to you. First thing is a monomer. A monomer is a single subunit of an organic molecule. Mono means single or one. So this is one section of those larger organic macromolecules, which is why we use the word macro, because macro means big. So carb monomer is a monosaccharide. The word saccharide actually means carbohydrate. Lipids actually don't have true monomers and polymers. I do use a term here just so you can kind of understand, but they don't work the same way, so they don't have what we call true monomers. But usually lipids are made up of what we call fatty acids. Protein monomer is amino acids. There's actually 20 different amino acids that make up all of our proteins, and then nucleic acids, which are made up of nucleotides. Polymers. A polymer is a many subunits linked together. Poly means many, and basically a polymer is a bunch of monomers that are stringed together, or long chains of monomers. For carbohydrates, that's a polysaccharide, again, many carb. Lipids, those fatty acids will actually join into hydrocarbon chains. So a hydrocarbon chain is the backbone of a lipid, but they're going to have some other things with them. Again, not a true polymer, but we're just using that term for now. And then proteins are polypeptides, which is many proteins. Peptide actually means protein. That's where that word comes from. And then nucleic acids, we have a polynucleotide. So all of those have poly on the front of them except for hydrocarbon chain. So that'll help you remember that they're all polymers. There are two processes that are actually important when it comes to macromolecules: dehydration synthesis and hydrolysis. So dehydration synthesis is the removal of water from a molecule to form a link or chain between two monomers. So dehydration, you should know what the word dehydrated means. If you're dehydrated, it means you probably should be drinking some water to help hydrate your body. So dehydration is taking out water. Now, synthesis. You might be familiar with the word synthesis. Synthesis means to make something. So you're making something by taking out water, is basically what that word means. So dehydration synthesis is important because it will take single monomers and link them into a complete polymer. When you have dehydration synthesis, it's actually an energy storing process because the energy is being put into the molecule by the removal of that. So creating bonds within the molecule is going to create energy. So hydrolysis is the opposite of that. So hydro, the prefix means water, and lysis actually means to break. So this word literally means water to break. So you're using water to break apart a bond. It's the addition of water to a molecule to break apart polymers. So you're going to break a polymer into different monomers. Your body's going to do this process when you eat food, because you really can't do much with the polymers. You want the monomers so you can build up proteins. You have glucose, which is a type of monosaccharide for energy, and there's other things. Hydrolysis is an energy releasing process. So whenever polymers are broken apart, the energy that was stored in those chemical bonds is released and used by the body in the form of something called ATP. Okay, so now let's talk about our first organic compound, carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are unique. They have a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So if I have 6 carbons, that means I also have 6 oxygens. But since hydrogen is a 2, it means I have 12 hydrogens. So it would be C6H12O6. Now that's actually an example of a monosaccharide, which we call glucose. Glucose is the important energy source for all of your body's reactions in your body for metabolism. Carbohydrates are what we call hydrophilic. Hydro means water, and philic actually means loving. So carbohydrates are water loving. They will mix readily with water. They will join with water, and they're very dissolvable in those substances. Different elements in carbs. Carbs only have 3 different elements in them: carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, again in a 1:2:1 ratio. Functions of carbs. Carbs are more of your energy source. They could be for short-term energy for the moment, or also energy storage. So if you eat too many carbohydrates in your diet, if you don't use that glucose that you consume from those carbs, you will store it, your body will convert it into fat, and that's how it becomes an energy storage. But also, energy storage is glycogen, which is found in the liver, which we'll talk about in a few slides. It's also a structural material. Not really so much for animals, but that's more for plants, and that's because of cellulose. So the monomer of carbohydrates, again, is a monosaccharide, and a monosaccharide is a single sugar subunit. 3 examples of monosaccharides include glucose, fructose, and galactose. Polymer of carbs is a polysaccharide. Again, carbs that are made by linking individual monomers together to form a large chain. Polysaccharides are composed of many glucose molecules strung together. So again, the picture here, it is a picture of a starch, which is a polysaccharide, but you can see if the part that's zoomed, you have repeating subunits of glucose actually make up that starch. A couple examples of carbohydrates that I want you to be familiar with is glucose. Glucose is C6H12O6. This is a formula that you need to get familiar with because we will use it when we talk about photosynthesis and cellular respiration. It's a very small carbohydrate, and its key roles are energy, to store energy, and also transport energy throughout the body. Next one is starch. Starch is a common storage carbohydrate. It's composed of a long chain of glucose molecules. Animals and plants use starch as a source of stored energy. So animals actually get their starch from plants. So when you consume corn or potatoes or other vegetables, that's actually the starch storage for that plant that you're consuming. Next one is glycogen. Glycogen is also a storage carbohydrate. It's stored by animals in the liver. When an organism or an animal needs more glucose, but it doesn't have a food source, it actually, as a last resort, will go to the liver and take that glycogen and break it down into glucose. Next one is cellulose. This is our last example for carbohydrate. It's a structural carbohydrate. It's a long chain of glucose molecules, much like glycogen and other starches. It's found in plant cell walls. It's what makes plant cell walls rigid. Animals are unable to break down cellulose for energy because they lack enzymes to digest it. There are some animals that have a symbiotic relationship with bacteria in their intestines, such as rudiments, which include cows, so they're able to actually digest that cellulose. Humans are not organisms that have that kind of bacteria, so that's why a lot of the times if you eat something that has a lot of cellulose, it's not actually fully digested. Okay, so that was our first type of macromolecule or organic compound. Let's look at the second one. The second one is lipids. Lipids contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but not in a ratio of 1:2:1. It's mainly carbon and hydrogen, which is those hydrocarbon chains, and there's a few oxygens in lipids. Lipids are actually the only kind of macromolecule that are going to be what we consider hydrophobic. Hydro means water and phobic means fearing. So that means they're not going to dissolve or mix with water, and that's because they don't mesh with it. Elements in lipids, again, is carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. These are the same elements that we also see in carbohydrates. Functions of lipids. There's lots of different functions of lipids. They're used as energy storage. They're also used for cushions of organs. So all of your organs actually have capsules around them that have fat, and that's to help keep them protected from impact and other things like that. Also insulation. So insulation especially when animals go into hibernation, they're going to put on a whole bunch of body fat, and that's to help. Two reasons. One, to help keep them warm, and also it's an energy source as they're sleeping throughout their hibernation. Lipids are also used for specific reactants for metabolic reactions, so they're important for metabolism and also for structural support. So again, these aren't true monomers, so I don't have monomer in front of it, but hydrocarbons are chains of carbons linked together, connected with hydrogen, and this is your basic lipid structure. It's going to look like this. So this is an example of a lipid. So you have your hydrocarbon chain. Fats. Fats is sometimes synonymous with the word lipid, but not all lipids are fats. Fats are an energy storage lipid molecules. Fats are going to have more hydrogen bonds than carbohydrates have. There are two types of fats, saturated fats and unsaturated fats. Saturated fats have the maximum number of hydrogen bonds. They're straight chain structure, they have single bonds, and they're solid at room temperature. So you notice I have all of those words in blue, and that's because if you're paying attention, saturated fats, straight, single, and solid all start with an S. So that's a way to remember the properties of saturated fats. Two examples of saturated fats include wax and butter. Unsaturated fats are fats that have less than maximum hydrogen bonds. They have a bent chain structure. They have double bonds, which cause bends, and they're liquid at room temperature. So your saturated fats are straight chain structure, so they stack on top of each other really nice, and that's why they're solid at room temperature. Now, unsaturated fats are going to have bends in those bonds, so they're not going to stack nice and neat on top of each other, and they're going to have a more fluid or liquid structure. Examples include olive oil and vegetable oil. Next one is phospholipids. Phospholipids are the lipids found in the plasma bilayer that's found on the outside of all of your cells. It provides structural support for cell membranes, and it has a two-part structure. It has a polar head and two nonpolar tails. We'll actually get into the structure of phospholipids in more detail later on in the semester. Example, next one is steroids. Steroids are a ring lipid that's used to make sex hormones in the body. So steroids are used to make estrogen if you're a female and testosterone if you're a male. Now, even though you're a female, you do have a small amount of testosterone, and that's because you have an organ in your body called the adrenal gland, which also makes other androgens. The same thing goes for males. You have a small amount of estrogen as well. Now, cholesterol is also an example of a steroid. Cholesterol is important in the formation of sex hormones, so you do have to have a little bit of cholesterol in your diet in order to make those things that you need. Next one that I want to talk about are pigments. Pigments are light-absorbing molecules. We'll talk about pigments later when we get into photosynthesis. Now, pigments are important because they capture light. Two examples include chlorophyll and carotenoids. Chlorophyll is a green pigment that's found in plants. It's active during the summer, and that's why plants are green. And then carotenoids actually come into effect during the fall when chlorophyll shuts down. So carotenoids can be yellows, orange. Our third group of macromolecules or organic compounds are proteins. Proteins are also hydrophilic, which means they're water-loving, so they're able to dissolve in water. The different elements that we have in proteins also includes carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. But now we're going to see a new element. We're also going to see nitrogen with it. Function of proteins. Proteins are important for structural support. They also play vital roles in metabolic activities, and they're used as signaling devices such as hormones and neurotransmitters. So proteins are important for your body to build hormones. So that's why you need protein in your diet. Monomer of proteins include amino acids. Those are the building blocks of proteins. So as you consume protein from, say, chicken or beef, your body will break it down into those individual amino acids and build the proteins that it needs for your own body. And there are 20 different types that are used to make all different types of proteins. Now, polymers of proteins are going to be polypeptides. Again, peptide means protein. There's something called a peptide bond, which is a bond between amino acids, and that is a protein bond. Now, proteins are composed of one or more polypeptides. Proteins actually have a unique structure where they will fold in on themselves. They have a primary structure, a secondary, and tertiary structure. And eventually, they're just very globular in shape. And that's because they form bonds between different molecules. So this picture right here, you actually can see an example of a bond that's forming. And that's a polypeptide that's starting to fold. Okay, let's look at some examples. The first one I want to talk about is collagen. Collagen is a fibrous protein that forms the matrix of your skin, ligaments, tendons, and bones. Collagen is the most important protein in the body. If you have a lot of collagen, your skin's going to look youthful. It's going to be very bouncy. As you start to age, your collagen actually breaks down, and that's why individuals that are older have saggier skin, and that's because they're lacking that collagen foundation. Enzymes is our next one. Enzymes are proteins that assist in chemical reactions that speed up those chemical reactions. They're also called organic catalysts. A catalyst is a substance that's going to speed up a chemical reaction where it is fast enough for an organism to survive. Without enzymes, your chemical reactions in your body would not happen quickly enough to actually keep you alive. So enzymes are super important. Now, enzymes, we're actually going to have their own week that will talk about the functions of enzymes and some other things about them and their major importance. Okay, our last group are nucleic acids. Nucleic acids are found in all living things. DNA is an example of a nucleic acid, and that is the blueprint of life. Everything that's living has its own unique set of DNA. Now, nucleic acids are made up of long chains of nucleotides. Nucleic acids are also hydrophilic, just like carbohydrates and proteins, which means they're water-loving. Now, elements in nucleic acids. We're going to see the 4 elements that are found in proteins, but also we're going to see phosphorus. So we have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Functions of nucleic acids. There are only 2 types of nucleic acids, DNA and RNA. Now, DNA is going to store hereditary information, and RNA is going to code for proteins. We will talk about those in much more detail next semester when we talk about DNA. Monomers of nucleic acids are called nucleotide. A nucleotide is a monomer of DNA that has 3 components. Those 3 components include a 5-carbon sugar, a phosphate group, and a nitrogen base. Now, the nitrogen bases that we'll see in DNA include adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. And if we have RNA, we're going to, instead of seeing thymine, we'll see uracil, but they all have a very similar structure. So this right here, phosphate group is off to the side. Then you have your 5-carbon sugar, and you can see it has 5 points and looks like a little house, and then your nitrogen base. Now, polymers of nucleotides are called polynucleotides, which are many repeating subunits of nucleotides. So you can see your phosphorus and sugar actually form a backbone of DNA, and they form like this. And then these nucleotides right here are actually going to form a bond with another nitrogen base on the other side. And that's the basic structure of DNA. Now, DNA, what is it? It's deoxyribonucleic acid. It has a unique type of sugar called deoxyribose. It has a double helix structure. Another thing that I want to point out is thymine is only found in DNA. It's missing in RNA, and it stores hereditary information. Now, DNA and RNA are related, but they're a little different. It's ribonucleic acid instead of deoxyribo. The sugar is ribose instead of deoxyribose. And as you can see, you probably noticed that both of those DNA and RNA are actually named after the type of sugar that's in them. RNA is a single strand or a single helix instead of a double helix, and it has uracil instead of thymine. And it codes for proteins. So RNA is important for your body. It helps your body make the proteins that it needs. Now, I have one more slide here, and I want to talk about ATP. ATP is not actually a nucleic acid, but it is related to nucleic acids. And that's because it actually has a very similar structure of nucleotide. So you can see here, ATP, it's called adenosine triphosphates. So adenosine is the nitrogen base with it, and then it has ribose in it. So that's the sugar that we have in RNA. But then there's also 3 phosphate groups right here. And that is all of them. They're linked together and they actually store energy. So ATP is the energy storage molecule of your body. And we'll talk about ATP in more detail when we talk about enzymes. It contains an organic base, a sugar, and 3 phosphate groups. All right, that video was a little longer, but this slideshow was a little longer. So, take your time with it. Make sure you watch it. I did mention a lot of important things in this. It always helps to actually watch the video. So make sure you take the time. I want to see at least 20 views on this by next week. And I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Bye.